Soon the sponge cake was baking. "I don't think Mr. Rogers will like this cake," said Amelia Bedelia. "I'll make my kind of cake, too. He does love butterscotch icing." So Amelia Bedelia baked another cake. "There now," she said, "I'll surprise him." Amelia Bedelia put the butterscotch cake in the cupboard. She put the sponge cake on a shelf. "My, this is a busy day," said Amelia Bedelia. "Let's see what's next." "Call Alcalo. Ask him to patch the front door screen." Amelia Bedelia shook her head. "Alcalo can't patch anything," she said. "I better do that myself." She got what she needed. And Amelia Bedelia patched that screen. Amelia Bedelia looked at the time. "Oh," she said, "I better get dinner started. Let me see what she wants." She read the list. "A chicken dinner will be fine." Amelia Bedelia shook her head. "What will she think of next?" she said. "Well, that won't take long to fix." Amelia Bedelia got everything ready. She set the table. Then she sat down to rest. Soon Mr. and Mrs. Rogers came home. "Amelia Bedelia!" yelled Mr. Rogers. "Coming!" called Amelia Bedelia. "What is that awful cloth on the front door?" said Mrs. Rogers. "You said to patch the screen," said Amelia Bedelia. "Can't patch without a patch." They went into the parlor. "Oh, my good pots!" said Mrs. Rogers. "And bad ones, too," said Amelia Bedelia. Mr. Rogers looked at the wood box. He shook his head, but he didn't say a word. They went into the kitchen. "The sponge cake is pretty," said Mrs. Rogers. "At least that's done right." Something caught Mr. Rogers' eye. He looked up. "What in tarnation is that?" he said. "The bread," said Amelia Bedelia. "I plumb forgot it. Do let me punch it down quick." She climbed up on a chair. Amelia Bedelia began to punch. Mr. and Mrs. Rogers just stared. The bread plopped to the floor. "Did I see what I thought I saw?" said Mr. Rogers. "You did," said Mrs. Rogers. "Now," said Amelia Bedelia, "dinner is ready when you are." "Well, you can cook," said Mrs. Rogers. "Dinner should be good." "I hope so," said Mr. Rogers. "I'm hungry." "Just serve the plates," said Mrs. Rogers. Mr. and Mrs. Rogers sat at a table. Amelia Bedelia brought in the plates. Mr. and Mrs. Rogers stared at the plates. But, that's cracked corn." "It's all kind of awful things," said Mrs. Rogers. "You said chicken dinner," said Amelia Bedelia. "That's what chickens eat for dinner." Mrs. Rogers was too angry to speak. "Take this mess away," said Mr. Rogers. Mrs. Rogers said, "Serve the cake and coffee." Amelia Bedelia did. Mr. Rogers took a big bite of cake. He spluttered and spit it out. "What in tarnation is in that?" he said. "Sponge," said Amelia Bedelia. Miss- Mrs. Rogers said, "To make a sponge cake." Suddenly Mr. Rogers laughed. He roared. Mrs. Rogers looked at the lumpy cake, then she laughed too. "But I'm still hungry," said Mr. Rogers. "I can fix that," said Amelia Bedelia. "I have a surprise for you." "Oh, no," said Mr. Rogers. "I can't stand another one," said Mrs. Rogers. Amelia Bedelia brought in milk and her butterscotch cake. "Ah," said Mr. Rogers. "Hurry," said Mrs. Rogers. "Give me some." Soon the whole cake was gone. "How do you do it, Amelia Bedelia?" said Mr. Rogers. "One minute we're hopping mad at you, and the next we know we can't do without you," said Mrs. Rogers. Amelia Bedelia smiled. "I guess I just understand your ways," she said.